Joining me today is Anthony Romero, the Executive Director of the American Civil Liberties Union, the nation's premier defender of civil liberties. There's no one better to help us understand what these executive orders mean, and I'm thrilled to have him in our studio. Hi, Anthony.
It's my pleasure, Katie. Lovely to see you.
Great to see you, and thank you for being here. So, wow, you guys, I guess, have been extremely busy. It's only the first week of Donald Trump's presidency. There's so much to discuss. But before we do, just so everyone is clear, what is the ACLU and what do you all do?
Oh, I'm glad you asked. It's a 100-year-old organization, 105 years old this month, in fact. Founded with the very simple premise to defend the rights of everyone in the U.S. It was at a time when women didn't even have the right to vote, and blacks were second-class citizens by rule of law. And a bunch of individuals, some young, aspirational, free-thinking folks got together and said, we have to create an organization that defends the rights of everybody. And over the years, we've grown that mission. Our challenge is to make sure that we live in a democracy and all citizens have their rights and liberties. Some of the founders included Helen Keller. At a time when no one was thinking about disability rights, she understood the importance of struggling for justice and equality.
And ideologically, Anthony, you all are not necessarily super progressive because you have defended people from really all sides of the spectrum.
Exactly. And that gets a lot of my liberal friends very mad at me. Like, how can you defend the rights of the neo-Nazis to march? We took that case in Charlottesville. We think that even the neo-Nazis, whose ideology I do not respect, do not believe in, they have a right to express their viewpoints in a democracy. And so when they tried to shut down their protests, we took them on as our clients. We represented recently the NRA, the National Rifle Association. The New York State governor was going after the NRA because they didn't like their gun owner policies. That's fine if Governor Cuomo at the time was just expressing a personal opinion. Perfectly inappropriate and unlawful to target them for their lawful First Amendment activities. So when our legal director argued the case for the NRA in the Supreme Court, and we won 9-0, people were like, wait a minute, what's going on here? But I think that's what's important when talking about rights for everybody. I mean everybody, and all rights for everyone. You don't get to pick and choose and say you have your Fifth Amendment rights, but not your First Amendment. And we'll protect you on the 14th Amendment, but not on the Second Amendment or the Fifth Amendment. It's really important that we see a whole protection of rights and liberties for everybody.
Well, let's talk about this flurry of executive orders. And first, how would you compare the challenges you face this time around versus the last Trump administration?
They're a lot more prepared. I mean, you saw them off the block with more than 40 executive orders within the first day. Last time around, I think the first executive order we challenged was the Muslim ban. And that was almost a week later, on January 27th, we challenged that one in 2017. This time around, it was literally within hours. We challenged the very first executive order 2 hours after it was signed on the Birthright citizenship issue. So they're much better prepared. They've actually scrubbed their executive orders, and so they're tighter. You can see that a great deal of thought and preparation went into it. Some of that through Project 2025, through the Federalist Society. They are more ideologically aligned. You know, there is not the same kind of diversity of viewpoint that you saw in the first Trump administration. You had people who were good old Republicans, like in the best sense. You had libertarians. You had people who were institutionalists. Now you see some of the leaders of the second Trump administration are much more ideologically aligned. They're all coming out of the Make America Great, the MAGA camp again. And so you have much more lockstep and cohesion
and fewer guardrails from people who may be challenging some of these things.
I say, and this is a judgment, of course, Katie, but I say there are no adults in the room. I mean, last time around you had a lot of folks who maybe we disagreed with, but they were people with experience and stature who were in the administration and were willing to put guardrails around the president. Now you have people who are really ideologically aligned and are going to let him run.
And now some of those very people may be targeted for investigations and even prosecutions.
Exactly. Milley and others.
Right. And
Pence,
John Kelly and all manner of people, right, who maybe, and didn't he just Mike Pompeo's security clearance was just taken away.
Exactly. You can see they're going to play a game of retribution. And it's not just against the liberals or the progressives. It's the people within their own party. Look at the vitriol he spews at Liz Cheney. I mean, Liz Cheney is not an ACLU card-carrying member. There's not a lot we've agreed with Liz Cheney. But she stood up on certain core principles when she thought that her own standard bearer for her own party went too far. And the aggression and the level of hate and vitriol that's levied against her from within the Republican Party, from within Donald Trump's camp, is just rather breathtaking.
And perhaps that's why President Biden gave her a preemptive pardon.
And
Which, will that hold? I mean, can they still
who knows?
investigate her and harm her in any way? How protective is that pardon?
We don't know. We've never been. I mean, this is part of what's so hard to figure out in some of these executive orders, or in the pardons, in this case, the preemptive pardons. We don't know how much they'll stick. I mean, certainly, that when the federal government deploys its full firepower on an individual, it's a lot. No matter, even if you're Liz Cheney, no matter, even if your father is Dick Cheney, when the U.S. government comes after you, that's like a train coming right at you.
So I guess time will tell.
So time will tell. And whether the pardon was written in a way that was sufficiently encompassing, whether judges will uphold the pardon, whether he will devil may care and try to run the gauntlet regardless. I mean, we will see. I mean, the first, sorry, I don't mean to switch.
No, go ahead.
But birthright citizenship.
I was going to actually go to birthright citizenship. There's so many areas that are being challenged. Let's just go through them.
Yeah.
And one is immigration. He's taken many steps in this arena. The Pentagon has deployed 1,500 active duty troops to the southern border. The head of the nation's immigration courts was fired. In Mexico, around 30,000 immigrants with asylum appointments arrived to find them canceled, and they weren't allowed to enter the country. But of course, the most controversial one, Anthony, is the end to birthright citizenship. First, let me get your response to this executive order.
Well, birthright citizenship is it's like trampling on sacred ground. Whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, or you're a liberal or you're a conservative. I mean, birthright citizenship is how we solved the problem of America's original sin, slavery. How did we convert the children of slaves into full citizens? We said that if you were born here, you were an American. And so for them to go after birthright citizenship, it's not just the immigrants. It's also the whole legacy of slavery and Reconstruction, and an effort to do away with that lasting legacy of discrimination. So when you go after birthright citizenship, it's like going after the Bible in some ways. It is our secular text. It's what made America great. It's what made the children of slaves citizens.
And it's also enshrined in the Constitution, in the 14th Amendment, right?
14th Amendment.
So if they want to end birthright citizenship, they would have to change the Constitution.
And they're going to make some arcane arguments, which we'll argue in court. It's also enshrined in statute. So there's you're wearing belts and suspenders on that one, because you have the Constitution and you have the statute. And they're going to argue some interpretation around this one clause in the 14th Amendment that they're going to say doesn't cover undocumented immigrants. We think this is a slam dunk. I don't usually predict how our cases turn out. I've been around way too long to see that. I have a very hard time imagining us losing this one.
You're already on the case. I know the ACLU, along with a coalition of 18 states and immigration groups, have filed lawsuits already challenging this executive order.
Right. So there are 3 different clusters of lawsuits. Ours was the first. Ours went in 1.5 hours after he signed. And then the state's attorneys general filed, and then a third lawsuit was filed by other states on the West Coast. And today a judge ruled on the third lawsuit to stop the enactment of birthright citizenship. But to step back and to kind of take it further, why it's a signal of what they're trying to do. The idea that you would create 2 different classes of citizens or residents. Like if you're born here, and you're born here, you should be an American. That's how it's always been. But now they would have to have you prove the citizenship of your parents. So unless one of your parents was not, if one of your parents was not here with records or with authorization, they would deny you citizenship even if you were born here. And so that's what is so stunning. And I think that when the American people begin to unpack it and understand it, they'll begin to say, no, that's going too far. I mean, Bruce Springsteen wrote a song on this, Born in the USA. You listen to the lyrics of that song like I did today, he's not talking about the law. He's not talking about the statute or the Constitution. He's talking about what's in our hearts. And so I think that they have fundamentally misjudged the American public sentiment. When people wake up, wait a minute, that anthem is it's in a song is more than a song. It's an anthem in our hearts. It's an anthem in our history and who we are as a people.
But who has ultimate authority over this, Anthony? Is it the states, individual states, these 18 states? Are there judges who will make the final decision?
Judges
Does
will make
Congress? So how do you see this playing out?
I think it's going to play on the courts. And I think there, as I mentioned, there are 3 suits already. I think ultimately we'll go before the Supreme Court. I think as I read the court, and I was there not too long ago watching our transgender rights case, I think for sure we have 3. I think very, very, very likely we have 7. Is this one that you even get the 9? I don't know. Alito and Thomas have always disappointed me, but I'm pretty confident we have the 7. And I think if Justice Roberts and Justice Coney Barrett and Justice Gorsuch and Justice Kavanaugh were to rule in a way that would eliminate birthright citizenship, they would really do a kind of a death blow, not just to what it means to be an American. They would do a death blow to the legitimacy of the Supreme Court. People like me who would just say, well, wait a minute, the court has 0 legitimacy. I've always been a defender.
Talk about precedents, right?
Talk about precedents. Talk about the original case where the Atlas Shrugged, right? It's an old case. We learned this in law school. Dred Scott. It's like the dirtiest case. It's a bad case. Like
Explain what Dred Scott is.
It allowed the government to say that blacks could be treated separately, right? And it created the Jim Crow law, separate but equal. And it's a farce. You read that case in law school because you want to read, this was a very bad case. The Supreme Court's not going to go back there and repeat an opinion that is like Dred Scott in 2025. And so then why did they do it? I think they're sending a message. I actually think that they may have done the analysis. They're not dumb folks. They've done the analysis like we've done. They know this is a hard one for them to win. But they want to send a clear message that they are hell-bent on pushing their anti-immigrant agenda. And so this is as much as a shot across the bow, if you will, about the other policies and executive orders, which are not so clear-cut for us. I wish they were. I think we'll have a good fight. We have good arguments. We'll do our very best. I'm not going to bet the family farm on the other cases because I think they're much harder. And so I think the birthright citizenship was a way for them to demonstrate, oh, no, we mean business. New sheriff in town, anti-immigrant.
I know that a federal judge in Seattle temporarily blocked his birthright citizenship executive order. He called it blatantly unconstitutional. Did that give you reason to be optimistic?
Yeah, I read it right before I came to you. Yes, because it basically stopped the enactment of the birthright citizenship order. And so it's not in effect now as a result of the judge's order today.
So it won't automatically go into effect? It will be for the courts to decide?
The courts will decide. There's a pause button that's been placed on the birthright citizenship executive order, and now we get to fight it out in court and see who wins at the end.
A lot of people asked us questions. There's a lot of fear out there about this. Someone wrote in, I am a legal immigrant with valid documents. I'm expecting a baby in March. What should I do?
They and their family need to make sure that they have the documents at their disposal. They should know their rights, but they should live. And they should live and know that folks like us and others will defend the rights of their child when they're born. We're not going to let this child be born in a kind of a legal limbo. Think about what would happen, Katie, if it happened. If we were allowed to repeal birthright citizenship, you would create a legal vehicle where you would have intergenerational stigma and discrimination, so that the child of this woman would not be entitled to the same rights that she's been entitled to. And that is just so wrong. It's so anathema to what this country is about.
Other questions include, how long could the litigation of protecting birthright citizenship take? Will people who have applications in process but aren't approved be deported? How far back will this executive order go for birthright citizenship? I mean, is the executive order existing law, or does it only exist after it's heard by the courts?
It's prospectively. So first off, the people who were born in this country are going to be citizens until the date in which the executive order goes into effect. It's in a couple of weeks. It's at the end of February. So it's not trying to do retroactive reversal of birthright citizenship.
But it will go into effect, and it will be the law of the land?
No, because that's what the courts have just done today. That's what we love litigation. Lawyers love litigation.
So nothing is carved in stone until it's heard by the courts.
They're going to, like the judge did it today, he granted a nationwide stay saying you cannot enforce this. You hit the pause button on the executive order. So people are going to be able, when they're born, they're going to be presumed U.S. citizens. They're going to get their certificates. They'll be able to get their passports. It's only at the end of all this that if the court were to rule, if I'm completely wrong, which I'll come back and eat my words, but if I'm completely wrong and the court upholds the executive order, then it goes into effect. And then they'd have to figure out, well, what do you do with these people born in that interim period? So that's why it's really a mess. Think about how much of a mess it is logistically. So the federal government doesn't issue birth certificates. My birth certificate's from the state of New York. I looked at mine yesterday. It has my mother, my father's name. It doesn't say anything about their citizenship. The state of New York doesn't know that when Couric and Demetrio Romero registered me as their son, they didn't ask their citizenship. How would you have people at city halls all of a sudden saying, "Oh, I got to see your mother's papers.
Right.
Show me her green card, or show me her lawful permanent residence status." I mean, it's logistically. That's why the state attorneys general, beyond the legal issues, it's a logistical horror show. I mean, how are you actually going to be able to enforce this?
The ACLU also announced it's suing the Trump administration over its plan to massively expand fast-track deportations without a fair legal process. So how are you all going to do that? And how are you educating and equipping refugees and immigrants in this country for how to respond if there are these roundups of people in cities across the country?
Yeah, we're most worried about those. So first on this, what you described, expedited removal, what the lawyers call expedited removal, which is an effort to say that we're going to move people through the system and deport them more quickly. And the reason why that's a problem is because we have certain statutory requirements. It's not in the Constitution. So it's not like birthright citizenship where you're wearing a belt and suspenders. Here you're just wearing a belt. It's a statutory belt. What the statute says, you're entitled to certain rights before you get removed from the country. And what the executive order is trying to do is to say, we're going to cut all those nice due process protections out. And we're going to move you out. We think you're undocumented. We have reason to believe you're undocumented. We're going to just move you through the system. And so we're going to challenge that on the basis that that's not what the statute says.
What do you think is going to happen with that?
I think we have a good shot. I think the challenge, though, is that Congress can capitulate and it can pass a law ratifying expedited removal. And then I lose my belt, right? And then it's much harder. So that's why I'm hopeful that we can talk about why is it important. Sometimes it's important just to have checks and balances in place. I'll give you one story. This is Trump 1, right, in 2018 or so. A Mexican-American U.S. citizen who had a learning disability every day would go home, would be at home, and every day his family would allow him to go out to the corner store. It was his moment of independence. You can imagine that, right? As you're a parent, you have an adult child, you want to say, okay, you go there and you come back. And one day he didn't come back, and he was picked up. And because he didn't have proof of citizenship, they deported him. He was a U.S. citizen.
How old was he?
He was a young adult. I want to say in his 20s or 30s. And I remember seeing his picture. That's what I guess his age is. And then somehow, after this U.S. citizen with a learning disability got deported to Mexico. He found his way to some family members, and then he came back, right? And then we brought his case against the government saying, no, when you deport people with learning disabilities, you have to provide them with due process protections. That's what due process is.
Or when you deport anyone.
Anybody.
Yeah.
But especially a U.S. citizen. You have to kind of go overboard and provide them protections because you'll make mistakes like this. And that's part of what we have to say to folks. It's like, this is about making sure that people who are innocent and who belong here don't get picked up in all of these raids.
Someone asked about the Lake and Riley Act and whether it's unconstitutional. This week it was passed by the House. It's a bill with bipartisan support that would allow the detention of undocumented immigrants accused of theft-related crimes. Now, at the face of it, this sounds pretty reasonable, right? Because we're talking about people who have committed crimes. What about that?
And it's a question of whether or not they've been accused, have they been charged, have they been adjudicated. I mean, that's part of the devil's always in the details. And so we're going to have to see how they kind of enforce this new law. It's a problem because I think it also sends a message that all undocumented immigrants, or many or most undocumented immigrants, are criminals. Most are law-abiding people who are in this country.
That's what that bishop said at the National Prayer Service to President Trump and his family.
I saw the scowl on his face. I saw J.D. Vance's kind of furrowed brow. So that they need to be spoken to directly about who are their policies really hurting. And I think part of what I'm most concerned about, Katie, is that the government has enormous latitude when it comes to deportations and raids. The government has a right to enforce our nation's immigration laws. We don't believe, the ACLU does not believe in open borders. We think it's appropriate for the country to enforce its laws. That's part of what defines a nation, the ability to define its parameters and define its borders. It's a matter of how. And so when we worry about these raids, it will be a question about who are they targeting and why. Are they targeting people who look a certain way, who dress a certain way, or speak a certain way? Are they giving them their rights? If they're charging them criminally, are you reading them the Miranda rights? And so the devil's going to be in so many of the details. And when you have the government with the full firepower going after a community that is perhaps not as well educated or perhaps not as informed about their rights, I really worry about the human impact and people who will get caught up in all of this.
And in fact, we've got a lot of questions about that, Anthony. How can schools protect students from ICE? How can we help support those being impacted by newly enacted immigration policies? What is the first step we can take to help refugees in our local communities? As an educator who has lots of immigrant families, what can I do to protect them? I think you have a lot of Americans wondering how they can help.
So we're going to tell them. We're going
Okay.
to try. So first, we have a whole bunch of Know Your Rights materials in a bunch of different languages, of course in English, about what are your rights if you find yourself in a situation where you're being questioned by an immigration officer or by law enforcement.
Or someone's knocking at your door.
Someone's knocking at your door. So people should download it and people should have it in multiple languages. We're running TV spots starting today in Spanish language media outlets to kind of tell them where to get this information and to know their rights.
Well, we'll put the website up. What is it exactly?
I'll get you it. It's in Spanish. I know Spanish, but I don't remember the name of this particular.
Well, actually, maybe we can put a link. Is there a link that will help guide people to all websites? Because you have a lot of West African immigrants here and
so
people
if they just
from
type
all
in
over the world.
ACLU Know Your Rights,
ACLU Know Your Rights.
it will come up.
.com?
No, if you just Google that, it will take you to my specific webpage with the Know Your Rights.
ACLU Know Your Rights.
There's a whole series of, and then they'll have them in different languages, different drop boxes for different languages.
What else are you doing? I mean, there are a lot of states that seem to be fighting this.
And then
is there going to be a conflict between like local authorities and ICE and federal agents, et cetera?
That's another thing we've done. So we work with local state governors, attorneys general, mayors, city councils. We just had a good success in New Mexico where we're trying to show them that there are things that governors and mayors and city councils can do. These sanctuary city laws are very important. Making sure that police do not collude in immigration enforcement. The government has a right to do immigration enforcement. They don't have a right to commandeer local cops. A very different role. Public safety is one, the other one's the federal enforcement of the laws. And so law enforcement officials are not necessarily going to have to listen to the directives of the Department of Homeland Security or
They're
Donald
not?
Trump. No. There's ways for them to kind of to stand back. You can't obstruct. They're not in the business of obstructing the federal government, but they don't have to become accomplices in this effort. The cops are different. The cops are here to protect us from crime. The cops are not here to deport those of us who are undocumented.
Do you foresee a lot of tension?
Oh, sure. And they're going to try to use the powers of the purse. I mean, Donald Trump has already said, if these blue state governors or mayors don't help us, I'm going to hold back these contracts and these federal dollars. So there will be litigation on that. Some of that we've prepared. Some of that the attorneys general are in a much better position to bring. So there'll be those flashpoints. There are also things that we've done to train ordinary people. We have had a training, I think about 2 weeks ago, for about 1,800 people on Zoom, so that they can know how they can observe these raids, film them, document them, make sure they have the information that will be readily available. The ACLU, we have an office in every state, but we're not in every single town. So we have to rely upon good folk who will then tell us, okay, there was a raid. What happened? Who did they arrest? Where are they being held? Were they charged with crimes? Were they allowed to post bond? There's also an effort that I think is going to be really important that some of the other immigrants' rights groups are leading, and we're helping, to create a vehicle, to create a fund to help people who find themselves in deportations. So if you need a lawyer and you can't afford one, this will help. If you need to post bond and you don't have the money to post bond, this will help you. If the breadwinner of the family is deported or detained and they need money to pay the rent or to pay for food, good old humanitarian help, blankets and food. And so the idea is to prepare a mechanism that allows people to support one another.
Would the ACLU get involved in some other actions like using the military at the border or the return to Mexico policy
Yes.
or canceling asylum hearings? Are those things that
Yes.
you will also get involved in?
So the canceling of asylum hearings, we already have joined that in one of our existing lawsuits, where we said they canceled all these appointments on these 30,000 people that you mentioned, and they're not taking any more applications. They can't do that. The statute clearly says that people have a right to apply for asylum. You don't have a right to have asylum, but you have a right to apply. And that goes back to what we saw during World War II, when we turned away so many refugees who were trying to get out of Hitler's grasp. And so many of those laws were put in place to say, in America, if you're fleeing persecution or violence, you have a right to apply. And we can turn you down, and you can change the standard by which you accept or reject, but as an ongoing right to apply, that's also core. So that's one suit we already have enjoined. The other ones are a bit more complicated. Remain in Mexico, we have to wait to see how it gets implemented. We had a lawsuit, so we're kind of like, we talk about, Trump has his zombies. We have our zombies. We have the Remain in Mexico lawsuit that we filed and now is dormant. Will rise again, I suppose, if they implement the Remain in Mexico policy. There are other efforts that I think we're still trying to understand in terms of how they implement them. And like in any situation, you can't just say, I'm suing because I don't like it. You have to have real people. Like our case on Birthright citizenship, we have an organization of undocumented people. We have a pregnant mother who's 8 months pregnant, whose child will be born after the executive order. And if the executive order goes into effect, her child's citizenship would be in question. So we have real people to show the harm of these policies and laws.
A lot of people who voted for Donald Trump, immigration was a big issue for them, as you know.
And I get it.
And they seem to appreciate that Donald Trump is taking these serious steps to curb the number of people coming into this country and to remove the people who are here illegally.
Yeah.
What would you say to those people, Anthony, about their support of some of these measures?
mean, I understand the fear. I understand the economic issues, people who feel that they're struggling to get a job or to put food on the table, and they
Or that this, influx has strained social services, for example, in their communities.
and it's also true that we have put resources behind immigrant communities who are in need. It's also true that immigrants have contributed. So you have to look at the cup half full and the cup half empty. And I think there's lots of contributions that immigrants have made. And for us, it's really a matter of how. How do we decide who we're going to deport? How are we going to make these really hard judgment calls? How are we going to deploy the government power when it wants to kind of enforce its laws? And I think the final thing I would just say is that on this issue, I think part of it is just having a good old honest conversation. There is something fundamentally broken with our immigration system. The idea that we can't process these applications in real time, that the fact there's a delay of 7 or 8 years, unacceptable. We're talking about putting men and people on the moon, on Mars, and we can't fix the backlog on the immigration system. And sure, people will abuse a system that takes 7 or 8 years to make a decision, and you say, okay, I'm going to hang out in America, even if you don't have a right to be here. If it's going to take you 7 years, I'm going to stick around.
It also takes forever to get a work permit.
And it gets a work permit. And so part of what we have to do is make the systems that we have work and resource them so that we can make those decisions. You are a victim of persecution and violence. You just came here breaking the rules and breaking the laws and jumping the queue. The first one we'll keep. The second one we might send back. They're making sure that you do that in a way that kind of ascertains the facts, that makes sure that you don't confuse the circumstances. And I think ultimately we need to have a conversation about who we are as a people.
I was going to say the solution has to adhere to American values and principles.
And who we
and the Constitution.
Totally. And then I think at the end of the day, it's also true that, for my organization, is even if it's unpopular, I'm not running for office. I don't need 51% of the public to agree with me. When we think we're right, we'll do it even if it's unpopular. And part of why organizations like mine exist is to stand up for the little guy, because the political process, who's voting for the undocumented immigrants? They can't vote. They don't have any representation in Congress. They can't vote people in or vote people out. So if you worry about the rights of all people, and this is where I get a little bit wonky. So, our founding fathers were really serious thinkers, right? There were some rights they reserved for certain groups of people. Like the right to vote was for all citizens, men initially. Now we were forced them to change that, but the right to vote was for all citizens. The due process rights, they were really crystal clear. No one shall be denied due process. No person shall be denied due process, right? And so the idea that they used that word persons, they understood that it was different than citizenship. So they granted a broader set of rights to a bigger group of people. And let's not go back on all those founding principles.
Let me ask you about another of President Trump's executive action, which states the U.S. government will now recognize only two sexes, male and female, and take aim at what it describes as, quote, gender ideology extremism. Clearly, the ACLU has been involved in a lot of gay rights issues and trans rights issues. What do you make of that? And I know where you stand, but what will you do?
So we're now studying that executive. We think it's obviously wrong, and we think it's unconstitutional. We argued a case in the Supreme Court last month, Katie, on the rights of minors to access gender-affirming health care in a state like Tennessee. And ultimately, we go back to the beginning when you asked me the question. We believe in the rights of all people, that we get to decide who we are. What God I worship, if no God at all, who I associate with, what I speak. It's not the government's position to decide what gender I am. And so part of what this is really kind of hurtful is that they're going to put people in harm's way. I mean, this executive order has the biggest impact immediately. There are 2,000 prisoners in the federal system who are transgender. Now, that might not be a popular issue for a lot of people, but just think about it if it were your child.
It was really hard and hurtful for Kamala Harris's candidacy,
And
right?
her answers on those questions hurt her with the general public. But unpack it. I think the one thing she did not do with deference and respect to her is she didn't explain it. So what does that mean? It doesn't. What it means most of all is if you were born female, if you were born male and are now a woman, and you get arrested, where are they going to put you? If they put you with all the guys, you know what's going to happen to them in those facilities. They're going to get assaulted. They're going to get abused. And so when you stand up for the rights of transgender people in prisons, that is the big question. And so that you have 2,000 people who are transgender in the federal prisons, who because President Trump, wants to say, you're not the gender you say you are. I'm going to put you back into the cell blocks of the people who were of the gender that you were born into. He's opening them up for enormous abuse in a way that not one of us wants. The second piece, which is more about passports, it's really an expression issue in my mind. I get to call myself Anthony David Romero. If I wanted to call myself David Anthony Romero, I have a right to express myself with that name.
If you wanted to call yourself Antonia.
Antonia or Katie David Romero. That's an expression that I have, an expressive right. And so I actually think that on the issues around passports and the gender markers for federal government documents, I think they're on much weaker ground. And I even think some good old conservatives on the Supreme Court are going to see it as an expressive issue. Why does the government care how I express myself?
But is this a case less about law and more about messaging and telegraphing the values that President Trump and many of his followers have? If they say they want to take aim at gender ideology, extremism, it's more about how trans people will be treated in the community writ large, right?
But it's also, yes, it is very much about how they'll get treated and whether they live their lives with full dignity and the full equality that everyone should be entitled to. But it's also fear-mongering, and it's also trying to score points on a very small community. It's 1.5 million people. It's an estimate. That's smaller than the borough of Brooklyn. And the idea that there is this mass hysteria, for me, it reminds me as a gay guy of what it was like in the 1980s. There was this whole kind of fear-mongering about what the gays were going to be like. We were going to ruin marriage if you let us get married, that we were going to prey upon children, that we were going to kind of break the fiber of the American family, focus on the family. Remember all that? And we were able to show, no, we're good people. we live amongst all of us, right? We love and cry the same way. And I dare say that anyone who's not had a transgender, I have a young transgender person in my life, not my child, but someone who I'm really close to. And it took a little bit for me to understand and to kind of support that person as well as I could. I love this child. The idea that we would enact laws that would put them in harm's way, that if for some reason this person gets picked up for driving on a suspended license, right? This is a great kid, and they're in college. But, kids make mistakes. And sometimes, let's say they were driving and they didn't take their driver's license. And then all of a sudden they find themselves in police custody without a driver's license and they're locked up for a night. I don't want them to put my lovely, wonderful child into a cell block with a bunch of men who will assault him because he was born male and he looks female now. With my money, taxpayer money, my child deserves better. And that's what this could be all about. And that's why it's so important that good, fair-minded people, and I understand that people have very different viewpoints, different ideologies, different religions, but I also think that people are inherently good people. And the hearts and the souls of the American people are people who are kind, caring, empathetic, and they don't want that harm to happen to anyone, little less one of our own.
given that executive order, can you give us a sense of what the mood is like, knowing this is not a monolithic community, but among many trans people in this country?
There's real fear. There's real fear. I mean, the ability for the government to make the lives of trans people much more difficult, to open them up to greater harm, to remove the protections that have been put in place. These have real life implications on over 1.5 million individuals. And so there's real fear about what's going to play out as a result of it.
I was going to say, what does it mean in practical terms? Like, what does that mean? There's only male and female. So does that mean that trans people will be, I just don't understand it.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a great question. We'll have to see how it gets enforced. That's part of what we're waiting to see, how it gets enforced so we can challenge it in court. It feels, first off, it means that trans people can be subjected to much more explicit discrimination. They could be denied health care benefits that they were getting previously in the federal government programs. They will not get. Trans people, we expect, will be banned from serving openly in the military. Trans people in federal facilities will be open to greater violence now as a result of this executive order. Trans kids who are protected by government rules from the Department of Education, those rules will be rescinded, and local education officials will make decisions about whether or not they protect their trans kids. So it's by repealing so many of the protections, they've opened up a hunting season. And sorry for the metaphor, Katie.
No, in fact, I was thinking it sounds like it's open season on trans people.
It is open season on trans people. And that's why we've got to stop it for all our sakes.
I think there was some amount of misinformation and fear, and in some cases, I think legitimate concerns that there was too much discussion of these issues at too young an age. I think many parents worry that they don't necessarily want their child in third grade to pick his or her pronouns, right? Yeah. And of course, you heard on the campaign trail, Anthony, oh, girls go to school and they come back as boys, or boys go to school and they come back as girls. I still think there's so much education to do about trans issues, but should there be better and stricter or more cohesive guidelines for educators when it comes to dealing with these issues? Because it seems like this is where a lot of the tension is being created.
And I think our educators are often in the best situation of figuring out what's the best way to have these conversations with kids. And I don't know, I'm less troubled with the kids who want to change their gender, because there were a lot of things I thought I wanted to be. I thought I wanted to be U.S. president when I was in the third grade, and I was quickly disabused of that by the time I got to college. I think kids try on different things and thoughts, and sometimes they're startling, and sometimes they're fun and they're whimsical, and I trust our educators who are closest to the kids to be able to make the best decisions. The one that drives me nuts is this case back I was mentioning to you. In Tennessee, there is this law that if you're trans and you want to take certain kind of drugs, hormones.
Like puberty blockers?
Puberty blockers, right? That if you're actually doing it because you want to transition, you're not allowed to do it. Or
you want to just put puberty on pause while
you
mature and develop.
But the same drugs, let's say I'm a 10-year-old, I have a 10-year-old son who's hitting puberty way too soon, right? And we don't want the body of a man and the mind and heart of a 9-year-old boy or 10-year-old boy. They can prescribe puberty blockers to that 9-year-old boy who's having premature puberty, and that's okay, right? Because we want to make sure that their body and their mind grow together. I think
it's called precocious puberty, right? Yeah.
Right? And that's what the hypocrisy is, right? It's just like, okay, the same drug, they talk about protecting young people from the harms of these drugs. Well, in one case, you will prescribe it. In the other case, you won't. And part of what that drives me nuts, I sat in the Supreme Court. I sat with my 16-year-old client, transgender. On either side of me were his parents. Who better to know what's the best interest of that 16-year-old? Not me. I just met them that day. I was one of their lawyers. The parents were in the best situation. How dare the government of Tennessee walk into the family living room of that family and say, oh no, we know better. We're making a rule for all of you. And I don't care what you think. I don't care what you know, mom and dad. You're taking a back seat to how you're going to raise your son. I mean, really? Is any parent going to accept that? And so that's why I think some of this is just common sense.
Let me close by asking you what people can do. I think a lot of people are feeling powerless. They are upset with some of the things that are happening, and they're happening with such speed and in such numbers, right? These big societal changes. What do you think is the best way to provide an opposing point of view when so much power is concentrated behind Donald Trump in Congress, in the courts, the Supreme Court, and people are wondering, where are the checks and balances?
I think the most important thing is they need to listen to people like you and shows like yours, and to stay engaged and informed. The thing I'm most worried about is people have told me they're tuning out, that they can't handle anymore. They're tired, they're exhausted, they're angry, they're resentful. And I get that, so you can tune out for a week or two, then you got to tune back in. You can't just check out forever, because that's when I really worry. People begin to kind of just look the other way and wash their hands of this and say, oh, there's so much going on, I can't be bothered.
I think people are exhausted, and it's hard to stay engaged, Anthony.
And so I think they come in and out, and I think it's okay to take a break. And I think they have to just find ways of learning the issues, having these hard conversations with their loved ones, with the members of their synagogue or their church. Having community conversations is really important on these issues. Then for people who want to take it the next step further, like we call the ladder of engagement, so knowledge of the issues is first ladder. Then you can figure out if you want to do something about it. Then there are tools for people to say, okay, put me to work. And there are phone banks, there are ways in which people can be in touch with their local elected officials. And then I think there are other ways in which people can be trained. There are some real skills that people can be taught. When the raids start happening and they start ripping apart, citizens and immigrants, and start mass deportations, we're going to need good people to step forward and say, put me to work. How can I do? How can I be a monitor? How can I be an observer? What can I document? How can I be a part of the solution? And I think that, I believe that we'll get there. Because ultimately I believe in the good heart and the fair-mindedness of most of our fellow Americans. And that's with a lot of people I don't agree with and don't agree with me. I believe that people want to do the right thing. They want to be fair. They want to be kind. They want to be empathetic. They may believe that maybe we've gone too far in some places, but I don't think they're filled with the same animus that sometimes I ascribe to pundits and political leaders like President Trump, who use an agenda as a way to score political points. I think if Donald Trump had a transgender person in his life the way I did, I'd like to think that maybe he would look at it differently. Maybe not. Maybe he's just so focused on exerting his power.
Anthony Romero, thank you so much.
Thank you, Katie.